Hey guys, welcome to the channel where today we're going to be covering Atari, its rise, its fall, and everything in between. This one took quite a bit of time to get together. These always do, so I appreciate any support you guys can give me, but hopefully you guys enjoy this one, and I will talk to you after the video. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to touch on one of the earliest home consoles to hit the American market, the Atari 2600, and its subsequent consoles, the 5200 and 7800. We'll talk about its inception, its rise, how often it's changed hands, all the way up to what it is today. However, before we get too deep into the Atari, we have to talk about the technology leading up to it and what made it an approachable option in the first place. With that in mind, let's go way back for a moment and look at how early video games worked before Atari. In the earliest days of video games, all video game consoles used mathematics-based logic technology. Variables would be used to determine relations and directions. This allowed them to use simple graphics to produce a wide range of games. This was also the technique that was pioneered by Ralph Bayers, who made the Brown Box. It was a military project that would eventually become the Magnavox Odyssey. Odyssey was the very first video game console, which we're not going to go into in too much detail here, but we do need to go into the basics because of the way the Odyssey was comprised and what it did for the industry. See, it was comprised of circuitry made up of diode transistor logic. Games themselves didn't really use cartridges, they used what was known as cards. I know, this sounds similar, but stick with me here, there's a point. Game cards were printed circuit boards that would plug into the console. These would then turn and modify internal circuitry like jumpers, causing the system to display different components and react to inputs differently. Think of it like reprogramming your computer every time you wanted to play a new game. This was released in 1972, right around the same time that Atari was actually formed. Before Atari existed, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney founded a small engineering company called SYZYGY Engineering in 1971, and began designing the first commercially available arcade game, Computer Space. Building on that success, they hired Al Alcorn as their first design engineer. Bushnell immediately tasked him with making an arcade version of Odyssey's tennis game and called it Pong. Riveting. Jokes aside, Pong was a huge hit, and the team decided to incorporate themselves in 1972 as Atari, which was based off a position in the game Go, when a group of stones is about to be taken and only has one free move left. In other terms, you're about to take an opponent's piece. Go was really popular on the college campus scene, so it worked for them on multiple levels. Atari, being no stranger to being more than a little shady, see the part where they blatantly stole tennis from Magnavox and made a mint off of it, decided that they wanted to hedge their bets in pinball distribution games, thus founded a subsidiary known as Key Games, headed up by Nolan's next-door neighbor, Joe Keenan. This was done to circumvent the instance where distributors wanting exclusive deals. This way both companies could offer such deals to competing pinball distributing companies by offering them each an exclusive deal on the exact same game. Welcome to the Wild West of video games, boys and girls. Joe did such a good job at this, in fact, that they promoted him to the president of Atari in that same year. Atari continued on like this for several years until they started the development of the first flexible console that was capable of playing the 4 existing Atari games that they had. The result was the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS. It would later be renamed the Atari 2600 once the Atari 5200 was released. This system worked much differently than the Odyssey. It used a MOS technology 6502 8-bit processor that was introduced that year, and one you may be familiar with if you've watched other videos on this channel, as it's the exact same processor that Nintendo would go on to use in the Famicom. They decided also to use a relatively new technology at the time called a ROM cartridge. This had just started seeing use a few years ago in 1972 by Hewlett-Packard. This could contain a program file that when connected to the computer via cartridge slot, it would allow them to load up a game. This provided a low-cost, flexible solution to store their games. They coupled this with their self-developed television interface adapter sound chip. This allowed them to do sound for the first time in a home console. The sound was also vastly improved from the days of the Pong arcade units. Now, Pong was one of the first games to actually have sound, but it wasn't sound as you know it. This was the beginning of programmable sound. No one had ever done this before. So, Al Alcorn walked into the office one day going, "How do you do this with digital circuits? Ones and zeros? He had no idea, so he just walked in and in the space of an hour found different tones that already existed on the sync generator. This was a device used to synchronize pulses delivered to in-studio equipment used in television broadcast studios. He gated out those sound frequencies to make sounds for the game. The VCS allowed for programmable sound rather than gated sound like the Pong machines. It allowed them to control 3 variables: the type of sound, the frequency, and the volume. It wasn't much, but it made for a much more diverse sound set than was available in the early days when Pong was first released. Even though all the pieces seemed to be there, the finances weren't. Atari was in deep debt with the development of the console and needed financial backing. Going public wasn't an option at the time because the stock market was in heavy decline, so they approached Warner Communications, better known today as Time Warner. Warner eventually agreed to buy Atari and kept Bushnell on as the head of the company. Finally, in 1977, the Atari VCS was released to the mainstream public, coming up 1 year short of being the first ROM-based console on the market, the first being the Fairchild Channel F. It had 9 games at launch and retailed for $199, which would roughly be $850 by today's standards. However, the launch wasn't without its own issues. Atari was failing to initially capture the public interest, and they were having issues dislodging the older single-game products. Then, in 1978, they began to be up against stiffer competition still, and the product continued to sit on the shelves. There was also the inaugural struggle with the administrative confusion at the main headquarters, and many of the Atari management disagreeing with Warner's more business-like approach. It was around this time that Bushnell was ousted from his position as chairman of the company, and new executives instilled that were more business-like, that instilled a new culture in the company. Gone was the come and go when you want policy of the old Atari. Warner also launched a $6 million advertising campaign designed to raise awareness and sell off some of the old inventory. The plan worked. The system began to sell, with store owners clamoring for more products to sell by early 1979. Atari was starting to take off, snapping up arcade licenses with hits like Space Invaders, Asteroids, Missile Command, to name just a few, being massive hits on the console. Atari was doing a great job of pumping out high-quality software, but they were lagging behind in the hardware department, with tons of competitors coming onto the scene like the Apple II, Television, and ColecoVision, all hitting, exploding the video game market. Atari needed a solution, and they needed it quick. It wouldn't be long before Atari would come out with what they felt was a solution to their competition with the Atari 5200. Originally meant to compete with the Intellivision, and ended up slugging it out with the ColecoVision, as well as many other consoles that had hit the market by 1982. However, the 5200 itself was plagued with a few problems, the first and foremost being its lack of backwards compatibility. You see, it wasn't backwards compatible with the 2600 library, which in and of itself wouldn't be a problem, save for the fact that the ColecoVision had a converter that would allow you to play 2600 games on it. The Intellivision 2 also had a converter that would allow you to play 2600 games on it. This comically led to the 5200 being one of the only of the 3 that couldn't play games from its own previous generation on it. What a mess. The 5200 also had a huge issue with the quality control of its controllers. They had major drifting issues and were poorly constructed. This made the product feel much cheaper than its predecessor. There was also reportedly a massive issue that people took with the console's size. It was pretty massive, which made it very awkward to fit into many places in the home. All of this started taking a heavy toll on Atari. More than 30 new game development houses started popping up, and all of them were trying to lure away Atari's in-house talent. On top of this, Warner made an announcement that they weren't going to make the projected sales goals for the year. This tanked the stock, and as a result, consequently led to an investigation of insider trading, as many of the executives in the company started selling off large portions of their stock right before the announcement. They also started losing ground in the computer market, with many of their competitors having better offerings. This forced them to cut prices on many of their home computers by a significant margin, leading to the first quarter losses of $46 million. Things only got worse from here, because by September of 1983, losses had ramped up to $180.3 million a quarter. They quickly brought in a new head executive who fired more than half of the company's 10,000 employees. None of these cost-cutting measures helped, however, and it wasn't long before Warner was looking for a buyer for Atari amongst the video game crash of 1983. Warner Media would eventually cut a deal with a man named Jack Tramiel, who was a businessman who had a solid reputation for himself as the head of Commodore International Ltd., most historically known for the Commodore 64. 3 days after he took over the company, he cut hundreds of employees and started taking steps to collect funds owed to the company. Unable to sell many of the unwanted game cartridges, he just had them dump them into a landfill in New Mexico. Tramiel started posing Atari to become a PC manufacturer first and foremost, one to rival Commodore, with the company developing the XE and the ST line of computers. The ST arrived late and really didn't have too much software to show off, but it was adopted rather well with the public at large, particularly in Europe. Despite all this good news, Tramiel continued to run Atari in crisis mode. The company's U.S. staff had been shrunk to 150 employees, and many of the executives agreed to have 1/3 of their salaries withheld indefinitely. This helped further turn things around, and by the end of 1985, they posted a loss of just $26.7 million, far better than it had been when Warner offloaded the company. Eventually, the gaming market would start to recover, with Nintendo having success with the NES and Sega having its success with the Master System console. Atari now felt it was time to start producing a console again, developing a more advanced one so it could compete with these two systems. They named it the Atari 7800. Ironically, this system actually could have been out before the NES, and technically it was. It released in 1984, but only in California. Given that Time Warner was so eager to get out of the gaming market at the time, they sold the company to Jack Tramiel before it could get a full wide release. Technically in July that same year. He decided to focus more on the PC side of the business, so exclusively so that it wasn't until 1986 that the console saw a wide release. When it did, it came out with the same games it was set to launch with in 1984. The issue with this is that the industry was starting to quickly move away from games like Joust and Asteroids, Defender, etc. They were starting to move towards games like Ghosts and Goblins and Super Mario Bros. These were games that were more focused on level progression rather than simply high scores. More and more of these were starting to appear on the gaming scene, changing the way gamers viewed video games. Couple this with the small marketing budget of $1 million, a small lineup of games, 10 to be exact, and you can see why the console wouldn't quite get the market penetration that they were hoping for. To give you an example, around this same time, Sega spent $9 million in marketing and had 20 games out. Nintendo spent $16 million with 36 games on the market at the exact same time. In the end, the 7800 would sell roughly 3.77 million units, a far cry from the 10 to 13 million Master System units and the colossal 61 million NES units that would be sold in the 8-bit generation. And in 1992, Atari would officially discontinue the 2600 and 7800 line of consoles. But this wouldn't be the last console Atari would try to launch. There would be one more system they would try to get into the market. Before we get to Atari's last home console, though, let's take a brief moment to recognize their first and only foray into the handheld market with the Atari Lynx. The Lynx was originally developed by a company called Apex as the Handy Game. It was developed by two former Amiga designers, R.J. Michael and David Needle. They were tasked by their former manager at Amiga, David Norris, at the prompting of his son's desire for him to make one. Development began in 1986, and development went fine up until around 1989 when the unit was shown off at CES. Around this time, the Apex would find themselves in some financial trouble. A pretty common story in these days. They needed to find a partner to get the system to the market. After some talks with Atari, Apex would reach an agreement where Atari would handle the production and marketing, and Apex would handle the software side. However, the long development time came with some new competition, the Game Boy. Everyone immediately began to compare the two systems to each other. On paper, the Lynx was a clear winner with a color screen that was backlit and better overall hardware specs. However, it lacked a killer app to move the system. Conversely, the Game Boy launched with Tetris and had the backing of Nintendo, a much more respected brand at the time. Couple this with a better lineup of games and being supported popular titles on the NES, and you can see how they quickly took the lead. Sega would also start to enter in the market with the Game Gear not long after, and the Lynx would lose its defining feature being the only color handheld on the market. They would continue to push the system, however, till around 1993, when their focus would shift towards the Jaguar. In November of 1993, the Jaguar would launch as the world's first 64-bit system. at a retail price of $250 in a marketing campaign of Do the Math. The claim being that it was superior to all the 16-bit and 32-bit systems on the market. However, it had a bit of an uphill battle. See, Atari had poor relations with developers, poor customer confidence, and an overall stigma of its tarnished name. It would also have one other issue to overcome. Many took issue with it calling itself a 64-bit system. I know, this is going to get me nearly as much crap as the Intellivision 16-bit processor, but we're going to dive into this anyway. Atari's reasoning on calling this system 64-bit was that it had two 32-bit Tom and Jerry processors that worked in tandem to add up to a 64-bit system. Electronic Gaming Monthly was fairly critical of this, saying Sega did its math the same way that Atari did. They'd had the first 112-bit system. Others claimed it really was a 64-bit system, since the DRAM path to the CPU was 64 bits wide. So in the end, it actually really did kind of come up to how you do the math, so to speak. The system had some success, but the titles were slow to come out, and a host of competitors like the Saturn and PlayStation were quickly on their way to coming out. In response, in 1995, Atari slashed the price of the Jaguar to a mere $150, so they could compete with the looming threat of these upcoming consoles. However, the heavy investment in development and the lack of funds on the marketing started to lead to a decline, and in November of 1995, there were rumors of mass layoffs happening at Atari. Atari officially denied these allegations. However, an official SEC filing in April 1996 would confirm that Atari had abandoned the Jaguar the same month and year of the supposed layoffs and were primarily fixated on liquidating existing stock. Eventually, in March of 1998, Atari would sell the Atari name and all its properties to Hasbro Interactive. Atari, as we knew it, was done. Hey guys, thanks for checking out the video and getting this far in it. I deeply appreciate it. These are kind of a labor of love and they're pretty time intensive. So if you guys haven't already, if you guys could go ahead and give me like a thumbs up on the video, I'd appreciate it. It's pretty huge and it helps me out with the YouTube metrics. Helps more people find this content, so hopefully more people will enjoy it. Also, if you haven't already and you like this video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the notify bell. That way it lets you know when I post new content. However, I'm going to go ahead and leave it here, and hopefully you guys will come back and check out the next one of these. These are pretty infrequent because they take, like I said, a significant period of time. But until next time, guys, happy gaming.